So today we are going to learn how to prepare profit and loss account. So profit and loss account pro forma is in the shape of capital T. In this pro forma we are having two sides, left hand side and right hand side. Left hand side called debit side and right hand side called credit side. On debit side, okay, so in this account pro forma we are having two sides, left hand side and right hand side. Left hand side called debit side, right hand side called credit side. Above this pro forma we must have to mention this account name. So this account name is profit and loss account. In second line you have to mention the date on which you are preparing this account. On debit side of profit and loss account we record all expenses and losses, and on credit side incomes and gains. So all expenses and losses are recorded on debit side and all incomes and gains are recorded on credit side. So expenses are classified into two types, capital and revenue. So in profit and loss account, only revenue expenses will appear. Revenue expenses further classified into two types, direct expenses and indirect expenses. All direct expenses already we recorded into trading account. Okay, so in this account, in this profit and loss account, on debit side we record revenue expenses, that too indirect expenses. What is indirect expenses? Indirect expenses are those expenses which relates to office. Okay, these are those expenses which incurred in office. All expenses which relates to office called indirect expenses. So indirect expenses in this account start with gross profit. Gross profit which we got in trading account. That gross profit is to be transferred from trading account to profit and loss account. So profit and loss account compulsory entry is gross profit. This account start with gross profit or gross loss. If there is gross loss, that gross loss should be recorded on debit side, because we record all expenses and losses on debit side. If there is gross profit, then gross profit should be recorded on its credit side, because all incomes and gains are recorded on credit side. So after making this a compulsory entry, okay, on debit side we'll record all revenue expenses, and among revenue expenses, which revenue expenses should be recorded into this account? Indirect expenses. So first we are recording indirect expenses, office related expenses. The first expenses which appears on debit side of profit and loss account is salaries. Salaries are those expenses or salary we pay, amount which we pay to our employee, those employees who are working in office. Okay, so those that salary, that expenditure will appear on debit side. Next item will appear, or which will appear on debit side of profit and loss account, is office rent. Office rent will appear on debit side of profit and loss account. If there is a factory rent, that factory rent will appear in trading account, because all factory related expenses appears in trading account and all office related expenses will appears in profit and loss account. Suppose if in the problem, okay, only rent is given, okay, if nothing is mentioned whether that rent relates to factory or office, then it is to be assumed that that rent relates to office, that is office rent. Because if when we pay factory rent, definitely in the problem that it will be mentioned clearly factory rent. If nothing is mentioned, if only rent is given, then it should be assumed as office rent and must be recorded into profit and loss account. Next is rates and taxes. Insurance, which insurance will appear in profit and loss account? Office insurance, because factory insurance will appear in trading account, office insurance will appear in profit and loss account. So here also same rule is applicable. If only insurance is given in the problem, then it is to be assumed as office insurance. Okay, factory rent, if there is factory rent, then in the problem definitely factory rent will be mentioned. Next is printing and stationery. Stationery which we purchase or amount of expenditure which we incur on purchasing stationery will appear on debit side of profit and loss account, because stationery is an item which we use in the office. So these expenses relate to office, therefore it will appear on debit side of profit and loss account. Next is audit fees. Auditor is a person who inspects the books of accounts, okay, who checks the books of account. Person who prepare books of account, that person is known as accountant. And after preparing account books, we will have the service of an auditor. Auditor will inspect, will check our books of accounts. Okay, so for that he will charge, okay, some fee. Okay, so fee which we are paying to auditor is an expenditure for us, and these expenses are these are revenue expenses and indirect expenses. Therefore, these expenses also appears in profit and loss account. Similarly, legal expenses, general expenses, and repairs. So these all are indirect expenses. Therefore, all these expenses will appear on debit side of profit and loss account. So beside recording these all are administrative expenses, office related expenses. Beside these office related expenses, some more expenses will appear in profit and loss account, and those expenses are selling and distribution expenses. So these are those expenses which we incurred on selling our product. Okay, so like carriage outward. Carriage outward is an expenditure which we incurred for moving goods, moving finished goods from our factory to market. So these expenses are revenue expenses and indirect expenses, because these are those expenses which are incurring after production, when we are moving goods, finished goods, after making the product. So these are those expenses which are incurring after production. Therefore, these expenses, all those expenses which incurred after production, will appear in profit and loss account. Next is advertisement. Advertisement also relates to sales. Okay, so amount which we are paying towards advertisement. Why we are paying for advertisement? For selling our product, for promotion of our product, for marketing of our product. So therefore, this expenses also relates to sales. All sales related expenses will appear in profit and loss account. Advertisement, commission paid to salesmen. Okay, bad debts. Bad debts. What is bad debt? Bad debt is a loss. Okay, it is a loss. Okay, irrecoverable amount from debtors. So debtors, who is a debtor? Debtor is a person from whom amount, if amount is receivable. Suppose you sold goods on credit to one of your customer. Okay, so suppose you sold 10,000 pieces of goods to your customer on credit. So 10,000 rupees is receivable from that person. So if we are not in a position to recover some amount from our debtors, so that is loss for us. That loss is known as bad debts. All expenses and losses appears on debit side of profit and loss account. So bad debt is a loss, so it will appear on debit side of profit and loss account. Next is traveling expenses. This is also indirect expenses. Next is packing expenses. Packing expenses are those expenses which incur after production. Okay, तो पैकिंग कब करवाते हो? प्रोडक्ट बनने के बाद. So all those expenses which incurred after productions will appear in profit and loss account. Okay, so packing expenses. Next, discount allowed to customers is loss for us. All losses appears in profit and loss account, debit side. Okay, so these are those items which will appear on debit side of profit and loss account. So which items appears, okay, so on debit side of profit and loss account? Revenue expenses, and then to indirect expenses. Okay, so this is a list of some items which appears on debit side of profit and loss account. Now coming on credit side of profit and loss account, what we record on credit side of profit and loss account? All incomes and gains. All expenses and losses are recorded on debit side. All incomes and gains are recorded on credit side. The first compulsory entry which appears on credit side of profit and loss account is gross profit. Next is discount received. When we receive discount, it will becomes income for us. When we allot discount, it will becomes loss for us. So all losses are recorded on debit side. So therefore, discount allot will appear on debit side. But when we receive discount, that discount will becomes income for us. And when we record all our incomes on credit side, therefore discount received will appear on credit side. Okay, interest received. When we receive interest, it will become income for us, will appear on credit side. When we paid interest, it will become loss for us. So interest paid will appear on debit side. Similarly, commission received, income, commission paid, loss, expenses or loss will appear on debit side. Commission received, income, it will appear on credit side. Next is rent received. Rent received is also our income. It will appear on credit side. So these are some items of incomes or gains which will appear on credit side of profit and loss account. So what is the main object of preparing profit and loss account? To know net profit, to know net profit of the concern. So after making all those entries, after recording all items, all expenses and losses items and incomes and gains items, we have to close this account by balancing this account. For balancing this account, you have to take total amount of debit side, then you have to take total amount of credit side. After taking both side total, you have to deduct lesser amount from greater amount. So difference amount is our profit or loss. If our incomes are more than our expenses, then the difference amount is our net profit. If our expenses are more than our income, then the difference amount is our loss, net loss. So excess of income over expenditure is our net profit. Excess of expenditure over income is our net loss. And where do we record that net profit or net loss? We always record balance amount on the lesser side. If debit side is the lesser side, that is our net profit. Okay, so that balance should be recorded on debit side. Okay, and it is our net profit, therefore to net profit. And if credit side is lesser side, our incomes are lesser than our expenses, so that difference amount is our net loss. So and we to record that balance amount on lesser side. So credit side is the lesser side, and that is our net loss. So therefore that loss should be recorded on credit side by net loss. So this is our profit and loss account. In our next video, we will learn how to prepare balance sheet.